Welcome to this data analytics tutorial that covers sales, cost, and gross profit analysis using pivot tables and charts in Excel. In this activity, we are using a sales and cost data set for a fictitious company, Cabinet Accessories Company, CAC. The sales and cost data covers 2014 to 2018. For this tutorial only, we are using a small 36 record data set. For the actual activity, you will be using the full data set, so the answers for the activity requirements will be different, but the process will be similar. For this tutorial on pivot tables and pivot charts, we will be demonstrating using Office 365 Excel for Windows. Other versions of Excel may be slightly different. Also note that there may be many ways of accomplishing the same thing. We are just presenting one way here. Make sure your version of Office 365 is updated. You may not see things the same way if you have not updated recently. Again, please be sure to update your version of Excel before working on this project. Certain features will not work if you are not using the most current version of Excel. Start this activity by opening the Excel workbook containing the dataset. You will be using the Excel file provided to create pivot tables and other data. Step-by-step instructions using the tutorial dataset follow for each of the requirements for the assignment. Requirement 1 asks, create 3 columns in the data worksheet that calculate sales revenue, variable cost, and contribution margin for each sales record. For the first step in the first requirement, go to cell K2 in the data worksheet, which is the cell under the column heading Sales Revenue. Enter the formula for sales revenue, which is equals H2 times J2. Point to the cells rather than typing them in. For the second step, click in cell L2, which is right below the column heading Variable Cost. Enter the formula for variable cost, which is equal I2 times J2. Again, point to the cells rather than typing in the names. For the third column, click in cell M2, which is the cell right below the column heading of contribution margin. Enter the formula for contribution margin, which is sales revenue minus variable cost, or equal K2 minus L2. Again, point to the cells rather than typing them in. There is a lot less potential for error that way. In the fourth step, copy the 3 formulas down to the rest of the rows by selecting the 3 cells and then double-clicking the small box in the lower right-hand corner of cell M2. For step 5, format the 3 columns by selecting the columns and then clicking on Format, Accounting Format with 2 decimal places. That's it. You have added 3 formatted columns to the data worksheet. Requirement 2 states, create a pivot table that shows sales revenue by region for each year. Correct any errors in the data set. Insert a pivot chart to show sales trends. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, on the ribbon, click Insert and then Pivot Table. Next, accept the defaults and click on OK. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 2. That will help to keep track of the different pivot tables. By the way, if the Pivot Table Fields panel ever disappears, you can bring it back by clicking anywhere in the pivot table you have created. The next step is to drag Region in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Rows box, Sales Revenue down to the Values box, and Date of Sale down to the Columns box. Next step, examine the pivot table now. Look for errors. We see that Central has been entered as Centrals at least once in the dataset. When you work on the large assigned dataset, there may be different errors, but the same visual inspection technique will work to find any errors. Now switch back to the data worksheet and click on Find and Select in the Home ribbon. Select Find and Replace. Type in the first error term you found in the pivot table and click Find Next. Replace with the corrected spelling. Do this process for each error you find in the pivot table. Here we just had one, centrals, instead of the correct central. For the next step, return to the Requirement 2 worksheet. Click in the data in the pivot table. Right-click and select Refresh. This process should update the pivot table so the errors you corrected are no longer in the pivot table. Next, we will format the data in the pivot table. Select the pivot table data and right-click to select Value Field Settings. You will most likely have to format each year of data separately. Just repeat these instructions for each year of data chosen. Select Number Format. Format the pivot table cells as accounting with 2 decimal places. Remember that you may need to select each year of data separately to format it. Just repeat the steps we just went through. Now we are going to insert a pivot chart in the same worksheet. Select the pivot table data. On the Insert ribbon, click on Pivot Chart. Next, select the line type of chart and then click on OK. The pivot chart now appears in the worksheet. However, we need to switch the data rows and columns. To switch the rows and columns, right-click the chart and click on Select Data. Next, click on the Switch Row/Column button at the top of the box. Now click OK to finalize the switch of the rows and columns. The pivot table rows and columns have now been switched, as well as the pivot chart data. Requirement 3 reads, create a pivot table that shows sales revenue, variable costs, and contribution margin for each year. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Click on the Insert tab and then click on Pivot Table. Next, accept the defaults and click on OK. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 3. That will just help to keep track of the various pivot tables. In the next step, drag Years and Region in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Rows box. Drag Sales Revenue, Variable Cost, and Contribution Margin down to the Values box. Next, select the pivot table data in column B for sales revenue. Right-click and select Value Field Settings. Next, click on Number Format. Select Accounting Format with 2 decimal places. Now repeat the formatting step for both the variable cost data and for the contribution margin data. This pivot table that shows sales revenue, variable cost, and contribution margin by year is now finished. Requirement 4 reads, create a pivot table that shows the most profitable brand in each year as measured by gross profit. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Click on the Insert tab and then click on Pivot Table. Accept the defaults and click on OK. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 4. That will help to keep track of the pivot tables. In the next step, drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Columns box. Drag Brand and Collection down to the Rows box. Drag Contribution Margin down to the Values box. Next, select the pivot table data, right-click, click Value Field Settings, Number Format, and Format as Accounting with 2 decimal places. Remember that you may have to format the data in each column separately. The pivot table is now done. It shows the most profitable brand each year. Requirement 5 reads, within each brand, what was the most profitable brand in 2018 as measured by contribution margin ratio? Use the field Years to filter the data to include just the year of 2018. You will need to add a calculated field to the pivot table to calculate the contribution margin ratio. Within each brand, sort the collections by gross profit percentage from the largest to the smallest. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, click on Insert and then Pivot Table. Next, accept the defaults for the pivot table and click OK. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 5. Numbering the worksheets helps to keep track of the pivot tables. Next, drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Filters box. Drag Brand and Collection down to the Rows box. Finally, drag Contribution Margin down to the Values box. Next, in the Analyze ribbon, click on Fields, Items, and Sets to add a calculated field. For the next step, insert calculated field using the name of CM ratio and the formula of equal contribution margin divided by sales revenue. Point to the fields and click Insert rather than typing them in. Select the data in the Sum of Contribution Margin column and right-click. Select Value Field Settings, Number Format, and Format as Accounting, 2 decimal places. Next, select the data in the CM ratio column and right-click. Select Value Field Settings, Number Format, and Format as a percentage. In the next step, in the Years filter box, select 2018 as the year to display only 2018 data. Click on a cell in the pivot table at the collection level. Here we will click on cell C5. Next, right-click and select Sort, and then sort largest to smallest. The pivot table is finished. We can see the most profitable and least profitable brands as measured by contribution margin ratio. Requirement 6 reads, complete the worksheet named segment margin. You will calculate each region's segment margin and operating income for 2018. You will link to the totals in the pivot table you created for requirement 3. You will get the fixed cost for calculating the segment margins from the fixed cost data worksheet. Go to the segment margin worksheet. Next, link to the sales revenue total in the pivot table from requirement 3 for the central region in cell B4 by typing an equal sign in the cell and then pointing to the relevant cell in requirement 3. Next, link to the variable cost total in the pivot table from requirement 3 for the central region in cell B5 by typing an equal sign in the cell and then pointing to the relevant cell in requirement 3. Next, calculate contribution margin by pointing to sales revenue and subtracting variable expenses. Type equal sign B4 minus B5. Now let's link to the direct fixed expenses in the worksheet named Fixed Cost Data for the central region by typing an equal sign in cell B7 and then pointing to the relevant cell in the Fixed Cost Data worksheet. Now calculate the segment margin by pointing to contribution margin and subtracting direct fixed expenses. Type equal sign B6 minus B7. Now link to the common allocated costs in the worksheet named Fixed Cost Data for the central region by typing an equal sign in cell B9 and then pointing to the relevant cell in the Fixed Cost Data worksheet. Calculate an operating income or loss by pointing to segment margin and subtracting fixed costs allocated to regions in cell B10. Repeat the previous steps for each of the remaining regions. You can copy most formulas, but remember that you cannot copy cells that refer to pivot tables. Any cells that point to the numbers in the pivot table in requirement 3 will need to each be linked individually rather than copied from another cell in the worksheet. In this tutorial, we only have 2 regions in the mini dataset, Central and South. When you use the full dataset, you will have data in every column. There are 8 regions in the full dataset. Now sum each of the rows in the Total of All Regions column. Start each sum with an equal sign sum, and then point to the cells you are adding. Now we can see the segment margin and operating income for each of the 8 regions. Remember, there are only 2 regions with data in this tutorial dataset, but you will have all 8 regions in the full dataset. That concludes this data analytics tutorial covering contribution margins, contribution margin ratios, and segment margins using Excel pivot tables and charts. This video was created and narrated by Dr. Wendy Tietz. Thanks for watching.